So I'm pleased to start this event this morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted as a member of the BCO Research Technical Committee and also the Board of Management to chair this session this morning. It's also a privilege to do so as a partner in Wedlake Bell. We've done a lot to support particularly our programme of Tomorrow's City, and the future of offices is obviously critical to that. Welcome to you all this morning. I hope you've got your coffee to hand and are tuned in. Please do use the chat function the question and answer function. I will try and take questions. The structure of today's session is going to be that there'll be a brief introduction. We will then hear the presentation of the research launch material, high office, fire safety in tall, super tall and megatall office buildings, drawing on this piece of international research that's been undertaken by eminent panelists that have joined me today, Professor Alexi Marmot and Madeleine Hank, both from the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment at UCL, well known and have collaborated regularly with the British Council of Offices, and also Steve Bosey, who is extremely well known in the industry from WSP UK, but also leads that team on facade engineering, and of course very much close to fire strategy and fire strategy issues, as I know from the many projects that Steve and I have had the pleasure of working on together. In terms of just kicking off the report, I wanted to say a few words about it. It's something where I think in times of increasing numbers of office-based employees, notwithstanding the circumstances we find ourselves in today, there is still a growth in those working in offices, and particularly in a more dense fashion. Both tall, super tall and mega tall buildings are something that we are seeing, and indeed seeing worldwide. So there's lots to draw on. Of course, we're all very mindful of the recent tragedies that we've had in tall buildings, notably in the residential sphere with the Grenfell Tower, which the debate, of course, is an inquiry is continuing. And so it's absolutely essential, I think, that we turn our attention to preventing fire and accidents and death from fire in tall buildings, and that this research, I think, has gone a long way to better understanding that and drawing some of the distinctions and providing information to share more widely in the office context. So of interest to investors in buildings, developers of tall buildings, designers, engineers, contractors, and in particular the occupiers and users of buildings, who will see this increasingly as a spotlight item when concerning their safety, which I think is going up the agenda with all the press we've seen with Grenfell. So without more ado, I'd like to welcome our panel. Professor Alexi Marmot is obviously an excellent person to lead this research in the sense of both her academic and professional roles. Not only is she a professor at the Facility and Environment in UCL's Bartlett faculty, but she's also more widely the director of the Bartlett Global Centre for Learning, and is connected worldwide with other leading institutions, and so able to draw on the wealth of academic research and actual physical reports out there in relation to this topic. She is also an architect and urban planner. She's authored many books on the subject, so who better to kick this research off and talk to us about it. She is joined by Dr. Madeleine Hank, who is a research associate also at the Bartlett. Madeleine, also an architect with a passion for workplaces and the built environment, and very much a focus for her on productivity and well-being. And she's joined Leesham, where she continues her research experience in offices and the home. And then Steve Bosey, well, what do I say? A chartered structural engineer by profession. Steve has been working in facade consultancy for over 20 25 years. And during this period of time, he has significant experience in design and construction, particularly of building envelopes, the way they perform for a variety of buildings, both from the outside the box signature architect level, blue chip clients, to more traditional envelopes that we see in offices. So a great deal of practical experience to draw on in the design field, in cladding and structures, and of course fire safety, and all the regulatory side that goes with that. He is currently leading the WSP facade engineering team in the UK and Europe. He's responsible for coordination and sharing technical knowledge, and that's a topic I know we will come to as part of this research report review. And we, of course, WSP, widely known globally, 150 professionals in this particular discipline, but worldwide, a respected global facade engineering practice. So without more ado, I think we will move straight into the report findings. And I'd like to invite Alexi to share her screen and kick us off on that one.
Thanks so much, Helen. Thanks for a very good introduction, but I really have to say, first of all, thanks to BCO for sponsoring the research, and that in this case, I have to confess that I don't feel like a huge expert. I may understand something about offices, but fire safety is not my specialty. So what happened with this research is that we came to it just asking really the innocent question, in the light of Grenfell and so much attention to fire safety, how are we doing in the office world and how can we begin to understand that? And I'm delighted that today we're able to launch this report that is the summary of quite a few months of research. And because both Madalena and I are not specifically knowledgeable in the field, but we've tried to ask the questions, we've done a lot of reading over the period of writing the report and had the benefit of consulting with some of the world's leading academics in the field who have been very good in trying to explain some of the areas of knowledge that we needed to understand in order to look at this question. So let's start with what we're talking about with tall, super tall and megatall buildings. The appeal of height is huge. We know that historically, the wonders of the universe almost were expressed by the creation of tall cathedrals. And today's tall cathedrals tend to be office buildings, and they're getting higher and higher. This is an example of the tallest 25 odd office buildings in the world. And what's quite interesting is that very few of them are actually in Europe these days. Sorry, I just skipped one. But the number of tall buildings completed annually is going up dramatically, as you can see in this chart from 1989 till more or less now, particularly in the last decade. There's been a huge increase in tall buildings across the world. And there's also an increase in the number of cities and countries with tall buildings. And by tall buildings, we are mostly using the definitions in the CTBUH, the Centre for Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, who define buildings that are megatall, the very tallest, of which so far there are only 3 in the world, as those over 600 meters high. The super talls are those over 300 meters high. And the ones which are simply tall, well, there's a little bit of confusion there. They know that they go up to 299 meters in their definitions, but the question is, when do you start to count them as tall? And in a country like the UK, we usually tend to use a fairly low height in talking about tall buildings. Depending which data you look at, sometimes it's 50 meters, sometimes it's 100 meters high. But whatever definition you use, there's a real growth going on around the world. In London in particular, which has more than any other city in the UK, this chart actually shows the number of buildings of different heights over the years. And again, you can see the increase, and the different lines show whether or not they're still in application stage, whether they have permission, or they're on site or they're already completed. London is the main centre of tall buildings, but we're not alone in the UK. And Birmingham is actually the next city with tall office buildings, and followed by Manchester and Cardiff. But modest levels compared with the rest of the world. Nonetheless, a very important area to be considering. And from our calculations, we figure that something like between about 300,000 and 500,000 desks are available desk spaces are available in tall office buildings. Interesting that that compares with something like 200,000 residents who live in tall buildings. So it's a significant number of people, and clearly understanding what goes on with their fire safety is very important indeed. The history of fire in cities and how high you can build is really fascinating. It goes back a long way. Controversy has always existed about the height of buildings and the basis on which planning authority would actually allow buildings to be built. And historically, at the end of the 19th century, you can see that, well, in fact, before that, most buildings in London were no higher than 6 stories. So in the order of, say, 20 meters. But gradually, over the late years of the 19th century, they started to increase, but not without controversy and debate. And so this block of mansions, which was variously proposed as being sometimes 12 stories high, sometimes 13 stories high, coming and going, as is the case with the height of many buildings. And those of you who have been involved in the design and planning of buildings will be aware of the changes that are sometimes made as one starts to, in the early stages, determine quite how a building might look. But the putting together of the issue of height together fire is not new. As you see here, one of the architectural commentators at the time was really concerned about the awful fate that might happen both to people within a building and to the neighborhood should a tall building be built and then catch fire. Planning authorities, of course, have to have ways of determining how high buildings are built. Sometimes it's about things like the air pattern over the city. In the case of London, there's always been an interest in preserving the historical view corridors, as they're called, that have been interpreted in varying ways over time. But the City of London itself has created maps like this, saying where it may be possible to build or not build, and then also looking at conservation areas. This plan shows where buildings in the City of London, where the tall buildings shown at different heights have been built. And you can see that in the end, they've been clustered in very small pockets of the City of London itself. And then, of course, other parts of the Greater London area have tall buildings. There's also been this sort of link between the vision of a city, of whether or not a city is truly a global city, and whether or not tall buildings should represent the city. And across the world, we see that increasingly in this rush to build high, it's often in order to sort of help put a city on the global map as a center to attract companies to invest. It somehow looks like you're a more serious city if you have some very tall buildings, and how better to have those tall buildings than to also give them some interesting and different forms, one from the other, so that the city's skyline is instantly recognizable by its tall buildings. In doing the research, one of the things that we were struck by is that back in the 70s, 1970s, which was an era like today of a huge growth in tall buildings, particularly in the United States, with varying European cities saying yes or no, or absolutely no, never, that's not who we are, to the idea of tall buildings. And at that time, there was a real investment in understanding height perceptions and preferences of individuals, and how also individual behaviour would be manifest should there be a fire, how that could be drawn into all of the emergency systems and regulations for firefighters to use, for central control systems within a building, and so on. Madalena and I searched for equivalent research more recently, and there's precious little. So we're struck by the fact that we're building more and more high buildings, high offices, and perhaps not asking simple questions like, if you had the same job and you were offered a location in a low building or a tall building, would you have a view? Would you worry about height? Or would you just love the height? And what did come out in this early 1970s research was that people loved the height and therefore really needed the view to the outside in order to really be comfortable. But I sort of mention this because I do think that this gap in research is important and is something that needs to be filled. Now, at the same time, there was also the utter terror of heights. And if anyone's had the courage to watch this classic film, The Towering Inferno, set in a tall, multi-use building that contains things like hotels, restaurants, offices, and living quarters, and then is set on fire on the evening of its opening with fairly disastrous consequences. But two absolutely magnificent heroes, one an architect, one a fire chief. You know, on the one hand is the pleasure of height, on the other hand is the fear of height. And that fear of fire at height, unfortunately, of course, has been realized in several very dramatic fires over the last few years. So what do we know about fire safety? Over to Madalena.
Thank you very much, Alexi. Just 1 second. Sorry, have I shared the wrong screen? Just a moment, please. Right. So a little bit of a good news that the numbers of fires and fire-related casualties are on a downward trend generally. That chart shows data for England, Scotland, and Wales, but the trend is similar if you look globally. However, buildings over 30 meters tall are particularly sensitive to fires. Offices and public buildings over 30 meters tall are approximately 4 times more likely to have fires that require attendance by fire and rescue services. And on top of that, in the UK, fire is one of the most expensive property insurance claims, with the average cost of fire claims doubling. It has doubled over the last 10 years. Now, Alexei touched a little bit on the history of this fascinating subject, but it all pretty much started with the Great Fire of London. To me, it was fascinating to discover how one event can lead to such major consequences for a lot of industries, really. So the Great Fire of London, it lasted for a few nights actually, and because the way buildings were built at the time, they were mostly made of timber. They were very close to one another. The blaze spread quickly, and a very large area of the city was affected. 13,000 homes were destroyed and many churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral. So it was a devastating blow to the city, but the city learned immediately. This triggered a review into what went wrong and what can we do to prevent this from happening ever again. And so the Fire of London, Great Fire of London, is associated with the origins of building regulations. That's the first time where regulations were set out to impose or ban certain construction materials and certain distances between buildings. And also the origins of the property insurance industry, because just in the following years, the first fire insurance schemes were born. And a little bit on that, we thought it's very interesting to highlight the role of the fire insurance industry into this area of research. So initially, there were fire insurance companies, and this was all done on a private basis. So different landowners would insure their buildings, and the different companies would use fire marks displayed on the buildings. So initially, what would happen is that the firefighting services that belong to these companies, they would look at the fire marks, and if the building was not insured by their company, they would let it burn initially. Obviously, this backfired because fire did spread to other buildings, and the fire insurance companies really started to pool their resources together, really started lobbying lobbying for funds, and therefore now we have London Fire Brigade. Initially, it was Metropolitan Fire Brigade, obtained by lobbying from the fire insurance companies. Now, a lot has changed since. A lot of progress has happened in the 20th century, but there's always this disconnect, this tension between some industries wanting regulation while others wanted deregulation. There is a quest for standardization, but the topic is still very controversial. Which brings us to the UK fire safety legislative framework. If I had to describe it very briefly, I would, and this is partly to reflect what we've learned from the experts we interviewed, is that it is somewhat reactive with regards to fires. So it is a broad set of documents with regards to fire. Those are called approved document B, and they regard means of warning and escape, the spread of fire, and access for the fire service. However, these are very broad. They don't necessarily go into a lot of detail. In addition to that, in 2005, the regulatory reform or fire safety order was introduced and because of that, everyone in office buildings needs to be covered by fire risk assessments and an emergency plan. Now, this is, again, a very interesting aspect of this research for me personally, was the disconnect between fire safety knowledge and fire safety practice. This is something that we, the fire safety experts we interviewed, highlighted. Most people involved in the design of buildings for fire safety, they follow a prescription, a prescriptive approach by which they follow the rules, which are often unnecessarily costly and often fail the test of reality. Compliance, making a building fire compliant, does not necessarily mean the building will be fire safe. And on top of that, new materials and techniques, building techniques appear almost every day. And the fire safety knowledge needs to keep up, needs to integrate these new ways of building. So instead, it's been suggested that a performance-based approach would be recommended, where you literally design the building according to its own purpose and how many occupants the building itself has, rather than following these this broad framework. Nonetheless, I mentioned before the fire safety order. Because of that, the order is accompanied by a 5-step checklist, by which building managers, for example, they need to follow these 5 simple steps to that refer to office buildings. All of them, not just all office buildings. So they need to identify fire hazards, identify who's most at risk, evaluate risk and prepare for it. And probably the most important steps are 4 and 5, which they need to record and plan and instruct and train their employees. You have fire marshals now, you have fire drills, and of course, review all this process regularly. And because of that, I feel like I should mention that fires in offices, at least in the UK, they are associated with the lowest numbers of fatalities, because people are trained, because they have a similar, the context is different. So this is probably a success. However, fire hazards in offices, well, it's not very difficult to have a fire in offices. Basically, all you need for a fire to start, you need a source of ignition, fuel, and oxygen. And you have plenty of those in offices. Electrical distribution is the biggest source of ignition when it comes to fires in offices. With regards to fuel, all the stationery, the packaging, the plastics and rubber furnishings, they all can contribute to the fire. The most common fire risks, however, are related to lack of planning of escape routes, somewhat confusion on how to escape, and of course, electrical faults. So that does not mean that fire cannot occur in the office environment. With regards to fire evacuation strategies, there is a lot to take in here. The report will provide a lot of detail on that. But basically, there's 4 key strategies: either defend in place, where you isolate the fire is isolated in its compartment of origin, and all the other ones pretty much involve evacuating the entire building population, either in phases or all at once, or with delays. But regardless of the strategy, all of them have to operate with these fire egress components. stairs are crucial. And when designing a building for fire safety, one needs to consider not just the width and what happens when you merge streams of evacuees, but also behavioral aspects. Some people might prefer to give way to others, causing delays perhaps. So there's the behavioral aspects that must always be on the forefront of thinking about fire evacuation strategy. Another thing that we discovered that all of these fire egress components, they need to remain smoke and heat free, which causes a lot of other implications for the building design, pretty much. And I think that is in a nutshell where my section ends. Alexi, over to you.
Thanks, Madalena. Can you now see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I think we now have to march on a bit. Okay, so now coming to Grenfell Tower and how the situation there has actually caused so much more attention to tallish buildings and what really can go wrong in the case of the tragedy that unfolded at Grenfell. And, you know, I must express here again that, like so many in the country, my thoughts are with the families of those who passed. And really, as one hears more and more about what actually happened, it appears to be a tragedy of so many different elements. And of course, what is good about it is that it has resulted in a lot of discussion, debate, evidence, and reports, including the Hackett report and the Grenfell Stage 1 inquiry, with the Stage 2 inquiry now underway. So we know that the Stage 1 inquiry, which really just examined what happened on the night, revealed a whole bunch of problems. Revealed a whole bunch of problems with communications not working in the way they should, with, for example, on the one hand, a very, very rapid response from the fire brigades, but unfortunately, actually seeing what was happening with the fire, which was seen immediately by the police helicopters, it turned out they were unable to communicate with the fire services. The system was not working. And so it went with much of the information that they would have needed to better fight the fire. Some of the knowledge that they had about the building was absent, should have had about the building was absent. That's both knowledge held centrally and therefore should have been electronically available to firefighters on the site was not there. There should also have been materials in the building and they weren't there, or they weren't up to date. So what comes out in the Stage 1 report is that the testing of materials was not as good as it would have been, and that there were many concerns as to the adequacy of the regulations, of the official guidance, of testing, of certifying competence and compliance, and in the marketing of the materials, in particular, the materials in which the building was clad. And of course, this has led to many further hardships and concerns for people in many residential buildings in particular that have had some form of overcladding similar to that on Grenfell, with people having to keep 24-hour watch for the fire safety of the buildings, the owners of such flats not being able to sell them, the value being far less in many cases than they paid, and so on. The stage 2 inquiry is now underway, and some of the early evidence that's been coming out there is really alarming for those of us in the design and building industry together, in terms of not well used, in terms of sometimes professional practices that should not be encouraged. And I won't say any more about the details of that. But how do we take this ahead in thinking about the fire considerations for office buildings? Firstly, there's the changing context in offices. Partly through planning, there's a desire in newer buildings, for example, to allow the public into high floors, to restaurants, to viewing points, so on, in places like the London building, the Shard. In fact, this was also one of the appeals of some of the very earliest tall buildings in the world, like the Empire State Building, but and before it, of course, the Eiffel Tower. The thrill of a view from on high. But the more that that's happening, obviously that means then that people who are unfamiliar with the building are there. And while on the one hand, there's fairly good control over who is in the building at a time, it does introduce a bunch of people who have not had the benefit, as office workers do, of regular fire drills. There's also been a desire for better communication between people within an organization in tall buildings. So it hasn't happened very much yet, but there is a trend to try and have open areas connecting floors within buildings with open staircases and so on. And that does, again, stop some of the smaller compartmentalization that might have been happening before. And of course, we also have continuing developments in the sorts of materials and the ways we put buildings together. These developments in timber engineering, for example, are introducing the possibility of lightweight timber floors on top of existing tall buildings to provide extra accommodation with relatively low loads on the building. And there's even structural timber is being used up to higher and higher levels over the last few years. So we have to continue to develop and refresh what we know about fires in buildings, about how they may operate under increasingly new and testing conditions. We need more fire specialists in fire engineering. It's been put to us that quite often some of the development is done by very well-trained civil engineers, but who have not been through a detailed course in fire engineering. And indeed, there are very, very few such courses in the world. There are issues about the independence of professional advisors, and also the need perhaps for rationalization of some of the agencies in the UK who deal with various aspects of regulations in buildings, sometimes allowing conflicting guidance to happen. But above all, it seems to us, as we think about the future of fire safety in office buildings, where potentially more and more people will be working, although we're not quite sure of how COVID will change the nature of the density at which people will use office buildings. But it seems to us that what we're really lacking is sufficient joined up thinking through all stages, from the very first ideas about how tall a building might be and what might be within it, to how that's then designed in detail, specified, how it's built on site, whether or not all of the assumptions about, for example, the integrity of compartmentalization happens, and whether or not that's actually fulfilled through the construction processes, whether or not it's fulfilled through later stages of refurbishment, changes of use within the buildings, and so on. whether or not the information is passed through sufficiently to those within an organization who are taking a decision to occupy a building, to create the conditions of safety in using the building, and whether or not that's being communicated to the occupants is really a subject for much greater thinking and intelligence in using the knowledge that we have in the future. So that's the end of the summary of our report. I very much hope that that you will read it and enjoy it, and help create a situation where we know more and more about fire safety in high offices, and ensure that that knowledge is spread to ensure that unnecessary loss of life and suffering does not increase.
Alexi, thank you, and Madalena, thank you for a very interesting tour through the research and report, and for drawing out those key findings. I've had the benefit of a sneak peek through, and I would definitely commend this. It's a very readable report, and I think for this type of topic that is essential, because one of the difficulties, it seems to me, is that a lot of the fire regulatory, as you say, is very prescriptive and compliance based, but also buried in layers of different places in building regs, in approved codes, and so on. And so that does concern me, particularly when I'm working daily in an industry that is going through huge change. You mentioned the RIBA stages, you mentioned the new materials. Of course, we've got modern methods of construction in place. So there's a huge change in the way that we design and build our buildings. And I think against that background, and knowing what you've said there about some of those key threads for fire safety in high offices, a great deal of current focus around residential buildings, which have illustrated some valuable insights into where disasters can happen and how things can so very rapidly go wrong, and so badly wrong, not just for life safety, but also in the investment world, the value of assets being so affected. Is there a reason for us to have a different approach between residential and office, and particularly high office? And what is the very key thing that you would consider needs to be addressed, drawing on some of those comments?
So firstly, I think it's not always a very clear distinction anymore between residential versus offices, because we are having many more buildings which have different functions within them, and certainly, for example, hotels and offices. You know, I've already mentioned some of those aspects, but I think it really is being very clear about how those differences need to be addressed through the life of development of buildings, and through their hopefully long lifetime after, and how all of that knowledge is communicated to the users. To me, it's that joined up thinking where a lot of the problems that Grenfell has revealed show up, and particularly also how the fire emergency services, again, are kept up to date with changes that go on all the time. I mean, one of the things that we've been struck by, again, in buildings that are fundamentally office buildings, are also, so what happens when you've got some restaurants, some wonderful restaurants in them, where there's actually introducing fires in order to open fires, in order to actually cook meals in the restaurants there, to, you know, cook them on display. And that's so obvious that that's probably been very well thought of, but one would want to be assured that that is the case.
That's very interesting, and I think I'm going to draw Steve in now in terms of some of the practical aspects, because you mentioned there this move towards the implications of coordinated information, and particularly for coordination between people on during the life of the project, during design and construction at first stage. And I would dare add there longer term on the use of the building and the management of the building. Steve, what were the key threads coming out of that for you? And do you think this report, will inform industry practice in a way that will change it? And if so, what would you say are the criteria there that need to be addressed, and how?
I think it's a very useful tool. The first thing to note, perhaps, with the Grenfell fire and the subsequent updated regulations is that was specifically for the residential sector. So the office sector, nothing has really changed at the moment, although we will see a significant redrafting of the building regulation coming out of the Hackett review. The important thing to note here is that as far as, if I can talk about my area of expertise, the cladding, the envelopes, buildings, office buildings traditionally are relatively safe from that perspective because they're constructed of materials such as glass, aluminium, and they use mineral wool insulation. They're all, if you like, of limited combustibility on safe territory. So they're not exposed to the same kind of risk as residential buildings. Residential buildings are a lot more complicated in their envelopes design because they have a higher performance requirements in terms of heat retention. So you then have to use more high-performing material, and these are not as good fire-wise as mineral wool. So I think it's important to keep the two separate, although recognizing that the impact of Grenfell will have an impact on office design, especially if we go into the mixed-use territory, the post-COVID world, where we've been talking about what will an office of the future look like, and I think there's a general acceptance now that it will be different from what it is now. What form it will take, what shape, we don't know, but there may well be provisions for living accommodations in an office building as part of a refit. So all of a sudden you have an office environment and a residential environment superimposed with different requirements, and that will necessitate quite a lot of in-depth thinking in terms of how we deal with an office which has been refitted. How do we deal with bringing in residential space in there? I mean, the question of staircases was mentioned earlier. All of a sudden you're connecting spaces which would have otherwise have been separated. What does that mean? As far as the cladding is concerned, I think that the report will actually stimulate a lot of thinking in terms of what do we expect a cladding system of an office building to do. At the moment, my perception is that we are relatively relaxed in terms of removing, sort of compartmentizing the envelope. So you saw from the previous sketch on the presentation from Madalena that there are some, in some countries, certainly the slab is taken to the outside to provide a positive fire break, whereas in the UK, we just tend to let the curtain wall run through, which has a number of implications. And I think we've tended to rely a lot on active measures such as sprinklers and means of escape to accept something which perhaps would not have been accepted in a more conservative country, if you like. Now, that does not mean to say the cladding is unsafe. There's no such inference there, but it does mean that we are, if you like, not out of sync, but we perhaps ought to think more about how do we compartmentize the cladding halfway up. There are fire breaks detailed in the system, obviously, but it's not always the positive break that certain countries adopt. And certainly I've post Grenfell, I've had quite a lot of dialogue with my colleagues in the Middle East, and in terms of what do we do to make buildings more safe. There's a very strong difference I noticed between the UK approach and the Middle Eastern approach, where in the UK we tend to try and replace the cladding. There's a lot of discussions in the press at the moment about cladding needing to be replaced, whereas in the Middle East, they tend to go for the source of the problem. So in other words, what can we do to the electrical wiring? What can we do to the bins at the back of the building, move them away from the cladding? They tend to look for a more holistic approach. And I think we should be doing perhaps more of that here. So it's a big cauldron of food for thought. And I think that the report will act as usual, as a good reference point within the debate.
I think that's really helpful to know. And I just want to bring Madalena in there because I was conscious that this research across the international arena, and you've heard what Steve has said, Madalena, about the practices in the Middle East and Asia in terms of design might be very different. Culturally, behaviour, of course, might be different of the occupier and user, and the regulatory frameworks will be different. Did you pick up any particular differences and experiences from talking in terms of international expertise in this area that you felt was particularly distinctive between the UK and elsewhere?
That's a very good question. I think I didn't necessarily note anything in particular, but a similarity in the sense that perhaps because there are fewer fires, everybody's somewhat relaxed in the sense that public funding allocated to fire safety research is limited anywhere across the globe. So that's something that I could tell. It's generally an area of research that doesn't get enough attention, doesn't get enough funds. Like Alexei mentioned, only a few institutions offer postgraduate studies in this field. So
maybe this is an area for the Bartlett to develop as a specialist field. Steve, on training, is that your experience in the industry when you're dealing at the coalface on projects? Do you feel that there is adequate experience across the professional and construction disciplines?
I think we could do better, if I'm honest.
Fine.
I think there's an appreciation. There's I see a lot of graduates that come into the industry, and obviously as a graduate, they need to learn and gain experience. So, but I think going on from there, I think that we ought to, as a profession, perhaps we could do a bit better. We could put more practical training into the equation. Also, the point was mentioned earlier about there not being sufficient number of fire engineers. Now, the criticism I've heard leveled at fire engineers, perhaps fairly or unfairly, or perhaps somewhere in between the two, is that a lot of them are concentrated on the strategy, on fire escapes, but there's precious little understanding. And there are some notable exceptions in the industry, but on a general basis, there is a lack of appreciation of actual construction materials, how they're assembled, and how the whole, in the case of a cladding system, how does the whole assembly perform in a fire? So practical training of fire engineers is probably one of the up on the uppermost list of to-dos. Facade engineers as well, we're not perfect, and there's a lot of learning that we could do. I think there's a lot of training that ought to be implemented. The other thing, of course, to note is that there seems to be in industry a push towards performance-based design, where the likes of myself, my colleagues in industry write performance specifications. But what that means is that the design is then cascaded down to the supply chain, and the quality of what comes back is very variable. Now, obviously, there are good examples and bad examples, and I don't want to name any here, but I think what might help is for professionals like myself, and I'm talking to lawyers and insurers, they might cringe, but I think compared to other professional, our counterparts in other countries, we don't actually carry a lot of final responsibility, in the sense that we don't actually sign off projects in the same way as other engineers do. and that would focus the mind in getting people trained and knowing what they have to look for and knowing what they have to design for. So I think the whole training of the profession does need some updating. Architects as well.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
training is a key message, and particularly response, I'm picking up response to change, coordination of information, particularly, and we're at a stage where there's dramatic changes in modern methods of construction and materials. The stages of a project are beginning to overlap. As you say, it's to me no single point of responsibility or accountability, and a single depository that's kept up to date and shared. And it does occur to me that the answers are there if we choose to look for them in practical terms. We have the BIM model. This could be a great depository for this type of information for the long life of the building, surely. And perhaps we also have the framework of the CDM regulations, which I saw come into being, and that creature called the principal designer. Maybe we need a parallel here with some sort of fire supremo who draws these threads from professional right through the project to the subcontractor and specialist, fabricator layers. And perhaps a longer term holistic view of the fire regulations once practical completion has occurred. How often do we really go back and manage that building from fire safety? I mean, I've dealt in the last few months with tenants of buildings, major city towers, wanting to, as you say, put in staircases and interfloor staircases. The way buildings are being used are different. They're wanting to introduce, very fancy canteens, something that's been mentioned. There are high-rise towers with restaurants on the roof. We've got public gardens now, public realm, or public access to private realm, with this sort of mixed use and flexibility, less compartmentalization, a much more villagey approach to life, both in terms of the central London scene and also high rise out of town. And that looks to me as though it's set to continue. So these are things which are going to be relevant for property damage. If you look at the value of property damage claims, fire accounts for a quite large proportion of insurance payouts. So surely there's a vested interest financially of insurers having better information and insisting on it, and also owners of buildings, investors. So I just think there may be some answers there, but there needs a little nudge, preferably not a towering inferno to tip us forward to the future. I'd like to ask each of you, because we're getting close to time now, to perhaps give me a final comment with that view to the future. There's some tremendous lessons here, I think, that we should be learning. So looking to the future, Alexi, what do you predict will be the key development to improve high office fire safety, and why?
I would hope that it will be, as Steve mentioned also, more education, more research, more knowledge, and better distribution of the knowledge, and it then being exposed right through the long life of buildings, to which it must really be applied to ensure fire safety in the future.
And Madalena?
I would agree with everything Alexi said, so nothing to add.
And Steve, your
Gosh,
thoughts?
I don't know where to start. I mean, just to touch on your point earlier, Helen. Yes, I think in terms of we need to do more in terms of capturing information, and the BIM modelling will probably go a long way to help that. And I think we should treat the building as a live, living thing, which something akin to a car, where you take the car in for services as you have a service book. But certainly the BIM will act as a very strong, powerful tool in order to allow anyone to interrogate the building, the virtual building, if you like, inside the model, in terms of what plant there is, what materials have been used, if anything expires, that needs to be replaced. So I'm digressing a little bit, but it's an important point. So BIM operation and maintenance manuals, which are currently dumped in a basement somewhere, they will become live tools that people will go in and interrogate, and that will help the building to maintain its asset value. Just on the point you made earlier about the regulatory, I think the Hackett review will go some way, quite a long way to that, in making sure that the next update to the building regulations will incorporate somebody who has a more definite responsibility for the fire performance of the buildings, like a fire supreme, or like, if you like, the equivalent of the principal design. And I welcome that entirely. In terms of what the future brings, abiding notes, gosh, difficult way to start. We're talking in the middle of a pandemic, and we've all talked about the office of the future. What will it be? My view is that it will be, as you say, a village, a much more interactive, morphable element where staircase, little lifts and other bits and pieces will come and go. So I think adaptability will be very key. The typical floor plate with sealed curtain wall is probably a thing of the past. We already see now this talk of, well, you know, we must open the windows to keep the virus at bay. You know, these are early discussions, but I think there will be an acceleration towards natural ventilation, which has already existed but has never really taken hold. So natural ventilation, more morphable elements in the building in terms of staircases, lifts, catering facilities, sleeping accommodations, to the point where I think an office will become a bubble. So, you know, as opposed to going to the office, you will have a bubble. And you know, this is looking very, very far ahead, maybe.
I think,
but that's my abiding thought, that the office will become a more morphable environment, and it will need to be more adaptable to changing requirements from the standard floor plate that we have now.
And looking at that, I think where I'm seeing the future is that that is going to drive a need for more regulation, because it will increase and change the risk profile and change the behaviour within buildings. And we can't just rely, as we seem to have done in offices, on the regular fire drill and evacuation procedures. And I think that will translate through to a better understanding of our office environment or office bubble, and perhaps driven by users and also investors wanting to know that is a safe environment. There's a bigger focus, I think, on personal safety and personal well-being coming across, very much driven by this pandemic and environmental age. And these factors, I think, as well as changing the way we occupy offices, perhaps on a more transitory basis, the need for more mixed use and different uses within traditionally an office building. And we haven't mentioned, of course, the disconnect with the planning regime and the change, retrofit opportunities of planning, you know, offices through to resi, change of use, so different criteria from an office when it was built. I think the need, and it's why I mentioned BIM and CDM very much to do that. And with facilities management, we heard the risks of many of the causes of fire, facilities management in mind. I think one of the challenges for managing future buildings and designing and retrofitting future buildings is this lack of information and this lack of fire strategy. I know, and it's something that's come up on the questions as we've been on the web, that facilities managers feel they very often inherit buildings they're transferred with no information. So definitely a need for models. And that's what drove the CDM environment, health and safety disasters that required a principal designer. So I do agree with you. I think we are going to see a fire supremo of sorts, and that will revolutionize the industry. I do think we will see more regulatory intervention, perhaps in a more, as you say, focused way with regard to actually what's happening on the ground. So possibly some more research there on how our out-of-date regulatory system that relies on information from a longer time ago can be updated and made much more user-friendly. I think this is a challenge for the BCO. We've recently, some of you will be aware listening, that we have actually recently launched the BCO guide to the specification officers, and obviously fire safety and strategy was one of the areas in that, taking regard of a lot of change in the industry. So that new guide is out there. The BCO is now focusing on the fit out guide, and I think again a very important area of that is how that translates into fire safety in the wider building and some of the asset management issues that go with that and the insurance issues that go with that. So great to have you all on board. There's some really useful information that's come out of the report. I would commend it to everyone, and please do continue the debate, feedback to the BCO. There's an active hashtag on Twitter, which I would encourage you to share your thoughts on, and indeed directly with BCO members or members of the panel today. Thank you very much for watching. Join us again, hashtag High Office Fire Safety, and we look forward to sharing more thoughts with you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen.